in a department that has as you pointed out in the report, that DC, the per capita, has one of the highest numbers of police in the country, per capita. So your response to these people, to this city, is not say, okay, let's figure out how we can look at this better. No, the response is, let's put more cops and let's arrest police.
So let me ask you something, Rhonda. Because part of the problem too is that its management or lack thereof, its resources or lack thereof. So
they don't lack no resources.
Well, it's again when the police are being called for everything from your child coming home on time to your water being cut off, then not that they should be, but they have to respond to that somehow. And so again, it is in part that the police perhaps could do a better job in terms of how they manage their resources, but I think also it has something to do with a better relationship with the community, where the community is somewhat educated about its role and its responsibilities, that don't put an undue burden on police simply because policing is a difficult job.
I agree with you.
Difficult, and not only difficult, but it can be very damaging. And what people oftentimes forget about police, I think, is that they're people too. I think someone made the point already.
No,
they're people too. And you don't know when someone shows up, you don't know if they've just come from a homicide or if they just came from a heroin overdose, around the corner from you, or if they just heard that their child is missing. They have issues too. But oftentimes I think people want the services of the police, but they don't have the understanding for the police. And that is not to give the police a pass, because there's a whole lot wrong with police in a lot of different places. But I think again, the involvement of the community, honesty of the community in taking on its role and its responsibility in what community policing actually means is something that's paramount here that can't be overlooked.
Yeah. Well, I think that we've thought about officers as individuals, community's relationship with officers relationships with the power structure, but there's also institutional issues within a police department itself. And so, for example, when you've got an officer who's responding to a mental health crisis, what kind of culture does the department have to support the officer who might be dealing with secondhand trauma from that incident? And what kind of response are other officers going to give to a fellow officer who's expressing concern about that? And likewise, what kind of norms are being fostered among officers about how they react to the community? And we had a great example of that in the district recently. We had a hearing about a officer who was alleged and found guilty of committing an obscenely inappropriate search, probing someone's most sensitive body parts repeatedly. And his defense was to say that in the Narcotics Special Investigation Division, this is what we do. If you want to get rid of this behavior, you're going to have to clean it out. And not only is it what we do, he said, but it's what we're taught to do in the academy. We're told, forget everything you learned in the academy during your field training. You need to go out and do things the real way, learn it on the streets. And so I think that, all of these factors combine to explain why there have been so many efforts to reform police departments, for decades now, and we still come back with these same sorts of problems because you're fighting the challenges of individuals, the challenges of institutional problems within a department, the lack of power of the communities that are most affected by those issues.
But the communities do have power.
Well, the communities...
It's clear. This question is which communities have power. I want to go back to the thing. That stuff does not happen in certain neighborhoods. It just does not happen. The situation, the case in Phoenix, or the case in Oklahoma, where 3 little black children got shot in a car, that is not going to happen. We're shooting at another suspect. So we violated policy as a police officer. We violated policy and we shot into a car with 3 children. And we hit a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 1-year-old. That doesn't happen in certain communities, because those communities have a different power.
So-
They have a different relationship with police
So to
departments.
Michael's point, you talked about all officers as first responders and whether they had the resources. I'm more concerned about whether they have the training, whether they should in fact even be in that situation in the first place, right? Resources are important, yes, but you have to be appropriate. You have to have the skill set here to basically deal with that populace. So if I'm called to a call where I've got an autistic person that is not responding to me, and I'm looking at him as if he's being disobedient or not compliant, do I use the same type of behavior as I would with someone who's obviously in their good senses? Would I know the difference? But going back to following up on the training, yes, it doesn't happen in certain communities, and this is why I continuously say we can have this discussion until the cows come home, but unless we do something different than what we've been doing for the last 100 years, we're going to have the same situation time and time again, and we'll be back to this conversation again. And if it means changing the way we hire folks, if it means doing something from a psychological perspective, if it means readjusting the relationship in the communities or the resources for certain communities, the answers I don't have, but I know it can't be the answers that we have today.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that, getting back to Michael's comment, I think, we know in studying organizational life, there's a saying that culture will eat policy and strategy for lunch every day. And the very thing you're talking about, or dinner in this case, yeah. So we're talking about, when we talk about training's great, and I've done training, I've conducted training for lots of police officers. And new policies are great too, but if you don't actually direct the culture of the organization, what expectations people have, people will ignore that all the time. And that's a very kind of thing that we're talking about, Ron, where somebody says, here's the policy, but we go out and do something completely different because that's the way we do things around here. And we've all seen that happen in any organization we work in, but of course the cost of it, again, thank you, the cost of it again, when we're dealing with police officers, is much higher.
When we worked on the book, we looked at that over and over again, and that was so true. We dealt with that in a couple of chapters. One was New Orleans. At one point, New Orleans was so corrupt. It was the culture. The culture was so corrupt that we had guys were getting arrested for every kind of crime that you can imagine. And I'm talking about from the top to the bottom. One officer got arrested for he took out a contract on a woman and killed her. Another one did an armed robbery and killed a Vietnamese family. It was massive. And so what they did was, in fact, a guy from here, the police chief from here, they hired him down. He either fired, in order to change that culture, he either fired or forced to retire 1/3 of the department.
Yeah, I know that.
And that was Richard Pennington. Right. So that culture,
noble member.
right? That culture then disappeared, but it took that dramatic action to do that. However, go ahead. That culture returned, and they ended up hiring a guy named Michael Harrison, who came up under Pennington, and he came in with a new policy and a new culture and created a new culture. One of the first things he did, they had a situation where a police officer struck a handcuff. The guy was in the police department, and he was handcuffed behind, and he said something about it to the police officer, and the police officer beat him. His partner stood there and looked at it. It was on camera. They fired the police officer, and then they fired the other guy who stood there and stood there looking at it. That didn't normally happen. But that changed the culture, and it goes back to what you're talking about, and that's one of the problems that's inside police departments. It's almost, unfortunately, inside many police departments, it's almost like a gang mentality. And here's why I say that. Because the street line is this: snitches get stitches. Snitches get stitches. That's what gangs all talk about. That's the street culture, right? Well, it's a similar situation in the police department. And I had cop after cop tell me stories about why they didn't report about what other cops did. They said, I'm not reporting that because I'm going to feel the pain behind it.
That's it. That's right.
And so that's the same thing. In other words, that quote-unquote code that you don't tell on blue. And it's so backwards because we're the people paying them.
But that's not
protect
new.
and we're the people. I know that, but it requires that change in culture.
Yes.
That I said that you have to break that code of silence.
Yes.
And it requires somebody at the top.
And there's some real survival there too, because we may be the people who are paying them, but we're not the people who on a day-to-day basis are threats to them.
But that's what I'm saying.
That's
That's
right.
why we have to. That's for
right.
me. I do a lot of emphasis on the people on the street. And there should be emphasis on people. Going back to what you're talking about in terms of training. The question is, who do we hire? Who are the people we hire? But too often in these incidents, everybody turns to that individual police officer and says, well, if he's got to go or she's got to go, and that's going to solve the problem. That does not solve the problem.
Let me ask.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, my question is this. I want to talk about DC particularly because I was covering many years ago the police department and other things. And this is before home rule, and most of the police department they lived in the suburbs, they lived in the south. And everybody said, okay, we're going to change this. And they brought in one police chief after another, who all had a different idea, and mayors had a different idea. And then up to the present time when we have Kathy Lanier, the first woman as the police chief, and everybody was praised because there was a new attitude. Now Tony is saying that we need to have the communities take control. But we've had police review boards, we've had citizen advisory councils. We've had all these things over the last 50 years. What more do you want the citizens to do, and why do we still have these problems if everything has been tried already?
Well, obviously, everything hasn't been tried.
Okay.
A lot's been tried, and what's been tried hasn't worked. So again, as I said, I don't have the solution, but I can say that what is not the solution is to give up, or to. And so again, when movements like Black Lives Matter, these the movements, these movements where the public takes a more aggressive, thank you, good word, more aggressive role. Again, while I'm not telling you that's the way to do it, you do have to, in my opinion, somehow be undaunted in your attack or in your defense of your rights. Whether that be whether you agree with who they are putting as a police chief, or or who you're going to the polls and you're electing certain people, or you're forming groups that do not go away after they've had their moment to shine for a brief period of time. Again, and I don't know that you can do it without finding officer friendly again. Okay, officer friendly hardly ever exists, it seems. The relationship between police and the community is very combustive. It's very fractured. But it wasn't always that way. Now, to Ron's point, a lot of what's happening has always happened. It really has happened, and it's been going on this way for a long time. But there were also good moments in it somewhere. And I think our job is to collectively go back and try to find it. I'm not preaching pie in the sky. I'm saying that we've got to do something, because what we're doing isn't working. And it may start with talking to an officer, becoming friendly with that officer, so that now you have a relationship that you can capitalize on. So when something goes wrong in your neighborhood, you have someone who you can call. Now he's going to have a bit of a lift still, because he's got to go back to his department and to his colleagues, and he's got to basically champion your cause when it's going to perhaps cause him some heartburn. But if you have a relationship where you have the trust, and when he knows that you're depending on him, maybe we can appeal to the better good of an individual to help us out along those lines. I don't know, but I just know that we are not getting anywhere right now.
Well, I got one suggestion of something that actually came from a police chief out of New York. He said every black church should have you got all these other ministries, audio video ministry, HIV ministry, they need to have a police ministry. I was like, what? He said, yeah, they need to have a police ministry. An organization, someone inside the church, their role is to meet with the local police in their area and say, this is what we expect. This is what we expect. In fact, not only do we expect that, we expect you to come to our church and make a report on the things that we are asking for. What kind of crime is in our neighborhood, things that we should look out for.
My homeowners association does it.
That's my point.
Yeah.
And in many communities, sometimes they don't have homeowners associations.
That's true.
And so that the church is almost uniquely set up, that because it exists almost in every community, that it could do that. And at that point, you develop that relationship. At that point, you can say to a police officer, you know, last week, or you can say this. Let me tell you, it's the difference between this. Kids do stupid stuff. So they're out throwing rocks off the bridge at cars. Okay, do you pick these kids up and take them down to juvenile? Or do you pick these kids up and say, I'm taking your little butt home to mom? Okay. Or does mom say to you, also I know that might not be part of the policy, but I would appreciate it if when our children are acting out in whatever way, please let us know so we can back you up.
Right.
I mean, it has to be, again, as you talked about, that a two-way street. But this same thing, this New York police chief, he said the same thing could happen in the school system. It's not that school systems should be working with police to alleviate certain situations, not to lock up kids or anything like that, not necessarily to decrease violence, but there are situations that happen that become police problems. You alluded to one is that, in particular in poor neighborhoods, everything is a police problem.
Everything is. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Everything is a
All
police problem.
All police.
If whatever it is, you know, the landlord said that they're gonna kick me out, people go to the police. It becomes, that's the nature of those relationships with police. But in more affluent neighborhoods, they do a whole different thing.
Over in Metropolitan Police District 6, the former Commander Taylor, he's since retired, I think maybe a year ago, 2 years ago. I was at a civil rights brunch with him over at Ben's General, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now. And one of the things that I was really impressed about with him was that he had a list of services that he had provided to people in his community so that they knew who to call. Now, it wasn't his job to do that,
Right.
but he knew that there was a problem with the community and it was taxing his department or his district because they were having to respond to that. So he said, this is the list of, this isn't it, but he said, this is the list. This is who you call when your water is shut off. This is who you call when your kid's not home from school. This is who you call when your electricity is not working. Okay. Now, I'm going to pass these out before we leave. We have a program in Noble called The Law and Your Community. And it is called, it's a conversation to avoid confrontation. But it's what you do, it teaches your youth what to do, and quite frankly, citizens in general, what to do when you have encounters with the police, whether it be a police stop via a vehicle, whether it be someone coming to your home to do a warrant, or whether they stop you just for walking down the street. At the end of the day, it's for a respectful and safe encounter between the citizen and police officers. We're in the process of trying to talk to DC Public Schools about doing this in the school system. We already do it in Noble, up in, I think, Chicago. They already have it implemented in the school system there. But it's something that we feel would be beneficial because we get folks, before they're predisposed to a whole lot of things that make their relationship or their opinion of law enforcement negative. And again, and to that point, you know, you guys, well, we're fighting an uphill battle to some extent because of social media. Okay, because of a lot of the messages, it's a wild, wild west, and there's so many messages that are misdirected and have ill consequences that people have access to, and they have ready access to. And you're having to basically put your thumb in that dike. We are having to put our thumb in that dike and tell folks this is not the reality. This is not the reality. You should not buy in on this. But that doesn't always work, and I think we're fighting a losing battle in that regard. And I'm not opposed to being able to share information, or have information, or have access to information, but you have to be responsible in that. And I'm sure that you all as journalists understand that very well.
Well, I think that one,
Yes.
Could you speak to proportionate response to incidents? The Phoenix case that you cited is a perfect example. Why, if the problem is a shoplifting doll, would guns be the response?
Because those lives don't matter.
No, I want to hear.
Again, my research on this now, and I will not say whether or not the entire story has come out. I'm told that it has not come out. The story that was publicized, as I have been able to view it, is that the 4-year-old girl took a doll, and the parents didn't see that. Now, one of the reports
dash or something.
later on that came out that the
Yeah.
parents were stealing things as well.
He stole some
But-
underwear. You gonna pull a gun on the guy?
Hold on. That's regardless of whether he stole something or not. Yes, it's illegal, and I think to Mike's point, or someone's point, you know, law enforcement officers are not to interpret the law, to enforce the law. But that notwithstanding, that behavior, and I think the police chief indicated that that was inappropriate. That was inappropriate based on the training that we have as law enforcement officers. That was excessive, and
But not unusual, right?
well,
That's why
not unusual across the spectrum, perhaps.
Yeah.
Well, let me back up. No. I'm not going to say it's not unusual. I'm going to say that what we oftentimes see in the media with such situations as that, it doesn't appear to be unusual. That's true. We see a lot of the very worst of police. And why? You guys are in the media because it sells. Because it gets people. Wait, hold on. Wait, let me finish.
I have to get there because you're talking about people are making choices to promote what is on social media because it sells, as opposed to people actually having the opportunity because they have the opportunity to video and record things that are happening around them.
No, I'm not speaking about that. That's not. And let me apologize.
You said that they were doing it because it sells.
No,
And
I said that it was all. I said what we saw, what we see is. I didn't say they were doing it because it sells. I said it sells. The media was doing it. I didn't say that the person who's videoed the young lady who had the video
the
camera.
person who's videoing it, that was you.
Let's make a distinction here between.
No, and then let's be
please,
very
go ahead.
clear about
Yes,
the
yes.
distinction. The person who is making those recordings, the people who are making those recordings, now have the
Which
opportunity.
people? I'm sorry. This is what I'm trying to
People,
understand.
I'm saying that people, it's
Citizens?
citizens who are making these
Okay.
recordings
Yes.
now have the opportunity because of the technology.
Yes,
to
I agree.
record things that have been happening all over the place.
Yes.
And were being publicized before.
Yes.
You're saying that these are the worst of the worst.
No,
And
I'm
the-
not saying that. That's not. Please don't
Well,
put words in my
you-
mouth. That's not what I'm saying. I'm making a distinction between citizens and media.
You
Please.
said the media does it because it sells. That's like saying the media shows Rodney
Exactly.
King. The
That's-
media show, every journalist in this room, I'm gonna just say a real quick thing. Every journalist in this room knew Rodney King situations and we could not prove them.
Because we didn't have. the
Because
video.
we did not have the, we had seen the stories, we had heard the stories, we had reported them, and newspapers, and the newspapers, and our newspapers.
But let me ask you-
Let me tell you something. Our newspapers would not publish them. Our newspapers would not publish those stories.
Okay.
Because they would accept the police's version. Everybody in this room knows this.
Well,
They was, no, I'm telling you, this is historic. This is historic. We saw these stories day in and day out. And we could not get them in the newspaper. We could look at the police report and say, wait a minute, this does not look right. We go back to our editors. The people said this. Well, the police said that unless you got more evidence. The way that story finally came out was when that Rodney King, and I was there in LA when all that happened. The police department in DC was so, in LA was so bad. We did a story about a disproportionate number of black people dying because of chokeholds. And the police chief said, this is before Rodney King, he said, well, when we choke normal people, they don't die. I swear to God, the guy who recorded that, who did the interview, was sitting across the desk from me, and he didn't realize the man had said it until he played the tape.
Right.
He played the tape. So that's what I'm just saying.
No,
When you
don't get me wrong.
When you say the media does this because it sells, we couldn't get them to sell that story.
Sales is, and again, I want to make it very clear that I'm not opposed to these stories. Okay, I'm not opposed to them hitting the media. And sales, I apologize, sales may be the wrong word. What I mean is that because they get attention. Okay, because they get attention, and regardless of whether or not you can get it out or not, you are trying to show a story that is important to show. So people are interested in the story. Now that's why, but unfortunately, the circumstances in our community today, we have too many of these stories. I would love for you
Why is it that there are too many of those stories?
because of ill policing, because there's a problem with policing, and we all acknowledge that. But the fact of the matter,
Everybody does it though.
well, I acknowledge it,
Yes.
okay? We acknowledge it, okay? So there's a problem with policing, which we are ready to acknowledge, and which again is why I said we have to do something differently. But when I say sell, I don't mean it's because you are gluttons for profit. That's not what I mean. I mean that you are trying to get a story out that people need to see, and that people are interested in. So what attracts my attention every
about
year.
is news.
I'm sorry.
We call that news.
That's okay. I call it news too. But you have a hard time getting the news out. And so
When a dog bites a man, that happens all the time. That's what. But when the man bites the dog, that is news. That is news. That's going to make the newspaper.
I understand. But so again, as we do, and this is what we're trying to champion.
Well, Allison, you.
Okay, so-
Let Miranda.
Because
I hear what
by the
you're
way,
saying.
that is a solution. And
What's
not
the
the one, and actually there's a, and I'll shut up
What's the
after let you say. No, to this whole situation, there's a police chief, it wasn't in Richmond, I thought it was in Richmond when I first heard about it, it was in Richmond, California. But I'm gonna let you talk, because he flipped the switch. This is a white police chief, who flipped the switch in a community that was, crime was rampant, murders were high, it was crazy. But he instituted a different, talking about culture again, he instituted a different culture and a different mindset. And he has now moved on to Tucson, Arizona, that totally changed that city. Crime went down, relationship went down, and just the last thing. So when they had a Black Lives, they would say, we're gonna have a Black Lives Matter march. So they had a Black Lives Matter march in Richmond, Virginia. Now what happened? They got there, the police was there, they all stood out. The police chief started holding Black Lives Matter signs, because he said, Black Lives do matter. Give me a sign. He said, we need to feed these people. One of his lieutenants came to him and said, we gotta feed them. They had a discussion about how we can do this better. Because it was a different dynamic in that community. They embraced the community. They put it to his program was so good, again, he got hired away from Tucson. We interviewed him for the book. Just an incredible individual. And he's the only, to my knowledge, only openly gay police chief in America. Fascinating. He's down in Tucson, Arizona. He is fascinating, man. Fascinating.
Oh, yeah, I think this idea of officer friendly, because I remember officer friendly, I used to love officer friendly. When he used to come in 6th grade and all that with the dog and the badge and the shit and the fire truck and people come. But I think the trust level is so bad that we have to start from like ground zero. Because I was just witness to a situation in Upper Northwest, a wealthy part of town, where a white man assaulted a black woman, like assaulted her. And so they came to, like the manager escorted him out with the bouncer, he got in his Mercedes and drove away, and the police came and asked her to come outside to identify the guy who just randomly, like, abused, like hit her. And she was like, I ain't going outside with these 2 white cops by myself. This is a professional woman.
Right.
She was like, I am not going out there. Are you crazy? So like, I don't even, so people like at the bar who didn't even know her were like, we'll walk outside with you just in case to be, and then people, of course, automatically pull out their cell phones because something that she was the victim, could turn into something totally opposite because the level of trust is so. Now, if this was a brother who slapped a white woman in a bar in Upper Northwest, Foggy Bottom, Georgetown, he wouldn't have been able to get in his Mercedes, bicycle, whatever he didn't know to get out.
You're not. You're not wasting this on me because I don't often care because my training is that if I see someone in danger, then I'm supposed to go and assist and help. But my concern is that with a badge and a weapon, they may not see the badge. They'll see the weapon. My colleagues in blue will see the weapon, and I may become a casualty. Now that troubles me because my job is to protect and serve. But
That's what my brother-in-law says too, and he's a captain in Miami Police. He's like, it's not just you, sister.
yes,
He's like,
that's exactly.
I look, you know, if I'm not like doing like this, and my badge is not, I could be a casualty too.
Yeah.
And he's a blue.
Right, and we saw a situation where, I think we had a situation where a police officer was reporting to duty, the two brothers were.
Prince George's County.
Prince George's County, they were attacking the police station, this crazy attack on the police station. And the guy he's coming to school, I'm sorry, he's coming to serve his shift to help, and he gets shot. He gets shot with friendly fire.
You know, I think that we've to go to this trust issue, you know, we've talked a lot about building trust by having better relations, trying to do better on that front, but there also has to be some sort of consequence for officer not so friendly. You know, and so the accountability
That's
part of
very
that, when you have more accountability, there's a way for people to feel, you know what, if this officer does something wrong, he's gonna face some consequences, and so you're more confident the officer won't do something wrong. So you talked about what have we done in DC? We've had these police officer chiefs change and so on. What we haven't done is empowered a civilian review board to actually be able to impose discipline on officers. So that's something we haven't done, and that's something we could do. So right now, a lot of discipline comes from the Internal Affairs Division. It comes from the U.S. Attorney's Office. But what we can't get is out of the system of people who are all part of this same culture, right? We need people who are outside the culture to police the culture because the police can't police themselves. And when they do police themselves, how can you trust them? So I think that's a starting point. It's not just.
Well, how do you get the civilian disciplinary?
But Dick just said that the civilians police has to be police.
Well,
they didn't work.
They have a review board, but the review board doesn't have the power to impose.
So the question is, how do you give high power?
Yeah, one of the challenges in this also gets back to what you were saying before, Ron, about the different experience people have in different communities, because oftentimes the communities that don't experience the issues we're talking about are the communities that have more power and influence over things like the government. And so the policies that might be put in place by people who are in the affected communities, but those people in the affected communities don't have the same kind of sway.
And the people are gonna say, we're not gonna do that.
That's right. Sorry, we're not gonna put our money there.
Yeah, I want to talk about what happened in Chicago. So I was there
Which
for.
one?
Well, yeah.
I mean, Chicago has spent
No, I
half
know,
$1
but
billion paying victims.
And that was the data project that we did at my organization.
Right.
So I want to talk about the accountability and the civilian review piece, because that is really key. But half of this stuff starts with police union contracts, because within those contracts, police have all sorts of special rights around due process that you and me don't get as citizens. People don't look enough at police union contracts. But the second piece, and I want to comment on, how do you take this conversation from black folks, brown folks getting knocked upside their heads to why anyone in the city should care, and that's money.
Right.
When we put together the list of settlements the city paid every year, first 3 years.
Who is the way I'm sorry?
I worked at I led a news organization called the Chicago Reporter. We did a database of payouts in police lawsuits.
Right.
Just in the first 3 years of this, $234 million in a 3-year time period. So that's two levels. That's money that could have gone to schools, that could have gone to parks, that could have gone to many other things, but instead went to settle police cases. So that's an issue if you live in the rich part of town. You will care.
They don't care.
Well,
They don't care.
let me finish my thought.
Because John
Let me finish though.
Okay.
That is one issue though of shifting the conversation. I agree with you.
I got you.
It didn't change the whole thing.
I got you.
But that's one piece of reporting
Right.
that I think we don't dig into. This means money that comes from a city's pocket to settle cases. So we addressed that. We also investigated the police union contracts, which allow for all sorts of opposition to training. Then we also looked at the lack of accountability. If you did something, how internal affairs may or may not deal with it. And then later, we had a whole list of police officers who showed up with multiple complaints and also lawsuits, and we're still on the fourth. That is the piece of accountability.
And what did you do with that information? I'm sorry.
We turned it into a public database and organized it by neighborhood. So that means if you lived in my neighborhood, which was predominantly African-American neighborhood, you could go in and see how much money the city paid out in settling police misconduct cases. Then I could go to another neighborhood that may have been a well-to-do neighborhood and see what did or didn't happen there. So we showed the disparities, but we also did a whole series that dealt with all sorts of issues related to why police are not held accountable. That was using, to your point at the beginning, the data, and how we can use data as journalists to really expose aspects of this that don't always get talked about. The last thing I want to say is this. The median average settlement in a police case, we talk about $5–6 million. No, it's $35,000.
Right.
That is chump change. And what is that? That's simple. I'm at the barbecue and I got stopped by the cop. And one thing led to the other, and next thing you know, I'm arrested. So those are, I wish we could tell those stories. We don't even tell those. We tell the $6 million story, and we have to fight to tell those, when the real story is a $35,000 number.
Which is like what was happening in Ferguson, where there were more warrants in the city of Ferguson.
Well, because it's cities making money.
That's
off
exactly
of
right.
police. So we don't tie that criminalization of poor people to cities earning revenue, coupled with all these other things that we're talking about. But I really actually have a question, so sorry.
What's your question?
My question though is, I haven't had a chance to read this report, but when you started to look and dig into patterns in Chicago, where it's also rapidly gentrifying but not on the same level, you know, a lot of the fines and fees are linked to criminalizing people who are poor or who you're trying to move out. And, you know, my question is, not having seen this report, if you had any indication of how many of these were linked to property, you know, so-called property crimes or nuisance crimes, which are often another code way of saying moving people out.
Yeah, I think that is such an important question, and we did find that there were a significant number of arrests for nonviolent crimes, for sure. And not all nonviolent crimes are necessarily poverty crimes, but there are also a significant number of arrests for poverty crimes. You know, one thing we looked into was driving without a permit. You know, maybe the reason you're driving without a permit is because you weren't able to afford one. Maybe it's because you were ensnared in the criminal justice system and your permit was suspended. Well, those actually would be a different set of offenses, but still, that can be a correlation between that type of offense and arrest. 10,000 people in the district arrested for driving without a permit. Not suspended permits, just driving without a permit. 78% of those people are black. Now, you got to think about that, because when you're an officer, you don't know the person has a suspended permit until you look at the permit. So that's
You got to stop for something.
That's right. That's exactly right.
That's exactly right.
You have to stop them
And
first.
so that's why we've been calling on the Metropolitan Police Department for, I guess we're getting into 3 years now, to fully comply with a statute passed by the DC Council demanding that they collect data on how many stops they make, whether the person is, the race of the person stopped. And we recently heard that they actually will be willing to give us some footage. They'll be willing to give us 31,000 body-worn camera videos. That's how they're keeping track of the race of people stopped, 31,000 camera videos. And to get that, they want us to pay something in the millions of dollars for redaction costs. So this goes back to what you were talking about before, to really, to be able to hold police accountable, we need transparency. And when the police impede transparency, it impedes accountability, and that impedes trust. So it is kind of this vicious cycle. We think, though, that if you start with the transparency, maybe you can flip it in the other way. But you've had a question for a long
Yeah, well,
time.
that's a good segue actually to my question, because the Metropolitan Police Department is notoriously bad at fulfilling FOIA requests. And I'm wondering what rationale they gave you to withhold the data for a year, which is way beyond the law.
Well, so with respect to much of the data, the rationale was they weren't collecting it. So we had to wait for them to start implementing the law. They didn't start implementing the law until 2.5 years after it was enacted. And the way they're implementing it again is completely out of line with what the council inspected. Again, the body, they were supposed to track race. The way they're doing that is with these body-worn camera videos. In order for us to see those videos, we would have to watch 157,600 minutes. that's a timetable from a Rent song. That's not a serious solution to policing in the district. And so, to your point, when the police department can just get away with not complying with stuff, that's a huge problem.
So where's the council oversight?
There you go. Who's supposed to hold them accountable?
Besides you and
Well,
journalists.
The journalists, the council, and the courts. You know,
Right,
we-
but who on the council is supposed to?
Well, I think that we would like to see the council take more action to enforce the statute, but they've already passed the law. And so we would expect the courts to enforce it, but we've been waiting for almost a year. We sued MPD. We sued them, we said, you know what, you guys have to comply with this law. The council passed this law. And the judge said, you know what, I'm inclined to issue an injunction saying they've got to comply. That statement happened in November of 2018. So, and part of the reason, we don't know, why that delay is happening, but we live in a culture where the police have a great deal of power, and so they're able to delay in this sort of way. And so this goes back to what Ron was talking about before is, who are the police responding to? It's not the community members who packed the courtroom, who came in on a Friday afternoon during working hours and said they wanted this data. It's someone else. And we need to increase the connection between the accountability to the community versus the accountability to the developers, to the retail, the people who have the money. It needs to be the people who are actually policed.
But the police,
Which council member has oversight responsibility? Which council member has oversight responsibility for the police?
Well, I
That's
think
another way of going
it's
at it.
under, I think, the Judiciary Committee's auspices.
but the
And that
thing,
is
but the thing,
Jay Duffy.
Charles Allen.
I'm sorry.
Charles Allen.
but the thing is, think about it for a minute. This thing is just so sad.
Duffy.
If it mattered to the mayor, it would be done. If it mattered to the police chief, it would. If it mattered, it would be done. If it mattered to the city council, it would be done. When that black guy, we're not holding the city council accountable. We're not holding the mayor accountable. You think if Bowser really felt some heat, she wouldn't get something done? But she's like, fine. She knows all these things are going on. It's not she's oblivious to.
She wants to expand the police force, right?
That's my point is, she's not oblivious to these things that are going on. And as you point out, they got $500 million on police, and you point up these issues. She says, you know what we need to do? We need to hire some more police officers. She didn't say, we really need to look into this issue and see who they're dealing with. So this is the status quo, and this is the status quo. And until the community holds those people accountable, no, you're not going to change.
I have a question, and that is, when I first came here many years ago, it was Prince George's County that had the reputation for having the worst cops.
We still do.
Virginia ain't that great.
Not like they used to be though.
Yeah, well, that was my question. How were they able to change? And also, does anybody have any
I'm not
observations?
sure they've changed. They got a
Really? You don't
What
hear much about it.
What happened is they got a black councilman, Wayne something. Wayne Curry, and he said, and he appointed a black police chief, and they said, well, you will know that things have changed when the black cop jacks up your son and he comes home beaten and bloody or is in the lockup for nothing. That because the black cop can do that same thing to your white son that you're doing to black boys.
This is what Wayne Curry said.
Dick, I disagree with your premise that DC suddenly now has the worst cops.
No.
They got the same cops. They got a new order.
Okay.
It's just a newsroom. Everybody's had a newsroom. New boss says, I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to stop covering foreign. We're going to start concentrating on the zones. We're going to do this. These are the same reporters. Same reporters do, but we got new marching orders. And so, that's my argument with the police chief. And I wish we talked about this. If we could see a study that went past before, if we could look at numbers that were in 2000 or let's say 1995, could we see a shift in the numbers in terms of disproportionality in who got arrested? You see what I'm saying? So if you tell me, no, we got a new sheriff in town or a new marching order, that is the marching order that the police do. That's my job. In Ferguson, for instance, those police officers, some of them were horrible. We wrote a story. We covered some really. I interviewed some stuff. Some of them were. However, a lot of them, they hired a new police chief. They hired they had a new police chief. No, this is a white guy. When Ferguson decided that this is what we want to do, we want to use the police department to raise revenue.
Yes. Right.
They went out and hired the St. Louis County officer. Wasn't even high up in the business, who was retiring. Then they got them a judge. They got them all locked up. Then they got a prosecuting attorney. And they used those three as a triumvirate. And then they trained the police. I mean, they literally had a session like this session room in here. They would say, okay, tell you what now. When you're arresting people for a traffic stop, you got to give them more than one ticket. You got to say, if you arrest them, stop them for speeding, check and see if their tags have expired. See if the wheels are too low. See if they got a tint on the window. One guy had given 12, he was a star, he gave 12 tickets. And if you didn't give enough tickets, you got written up on the board every month about how many tickets you gave. Now, you can say these are horrible police officers, but these were, if you want to keep your job, that was the order. And that's what I'm saying. I can't say that all these police officers suddenly became bad police officers, but I'm saying the orders have changed.
But that's not atypical for municipalities that are struggling and need revenue development. That's not uncommon, unfortunately.
But what reflects on it, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. But with, and I want to go back to the great work that you did with your report and all, and then we're talking about holding particularly council accountable. So these are the types of things that you, again, when you have low-income folks who go take a day off from work, that's going to harm them because they can't afford to do that, but it's important enough for them to go down to the city council and to sit in there for hours while they try to champion this cause. They can do that maybe once, maybe twice, but they can't continuously do that. So something has to shift where it's that type of behavior is more possible, or where their voice is heard more readily, or it's a stronger voice. Because again, the people who have power, those people who are in control, they're not looking to change things that are going to be painful. They're just not. This is our world, and in their defense, maybe they don't even know how to do it. Maybe they just say, "This is the best I can do, or this is all I'm willing to do." So again, until how do you hold that council accountable? How do you give the public more of a voice so that it can make a difference? How do you change this dynamic, this continuous battle that has been going on for ages and has not produced it has not produced enough positive results? That's the issue. And again, I know we have a lot of plausible solutions, but I am not about, quite frankly, even with the officer-friendly situation. Officer-friendly, he was great with the kids at school, but he might have been clubbing somebody in the back alley.
Hold on to at least that one fantasy, right?
Not your officer-friendly, okay?
I want to jump back for a minute to the point that Ron was making, because I think Ron, the point you're making is so important. The structure creates behavior. And when you have a structure, for example, you're talking about people get rewarded for more tickets, you could tell people all the thing you want about the integrity of policing and everything else, but if that structure is rewarding that behavior, that's a behavior you're going to get. Right. And the other thing, I want to touch back on the question somebody asked about disproportionality, because I think it's so important for us to recognize that anytime you have any kind of systemic bias, whether it's racism or sexism or anything else, proportionality is mostly how that gets played out. You see the extreme examples, but the daily examples are proportionality. So just as an example, at Yale they did a study in New Haven of what Marian Wright Edelman called the cradle to prison pipeline, and because when we look at these statistics, what we see is that the difference between performance between black and white children in the first 10, 12 years of their lives isn't that different. What happens is something happens between the ages of 10 and 13 that makes it go like this. And what they discovered was the thing that happened between the ages of 10 and 13 that made that happen, the major influence was that when kids get in trouble, black kids got suspended and white kids got detention. Right. So the black kids get kicked out of school, they're 12, 13 years old, they get kicked out of school. Who do they hang out with all day? Because their parents aren't sitting around waiting for them. If you've got a 13-year-old, you're not home waiting for them, you're working or doing whatever you're doing. So they hang out with other kids who got kicked out of school. They get involved in more group or gang activity. So being kicked out of school then leads to going to prison. to dropping out, and then dropping out leads to going to prison, and it's almost a direct line. And the same thing happens in almost every other case we could look at, that proportionality is a huge factor in this, and that's where the subtle emotional reactions play a huge role, because why do I disproportionately respond to a kid who's coming up to me who's black versus a kid who's coming up to me for white? It's fear. It's generated fear that comes from stereotyping and all these bigoted stereotypes that people are encountering their whole lives. This person looks and feels more dangerous to me. Therefore, the part of me that has power, this is where the macho piece sticks in, the macho part of me is going to show him that he's not going to push me around. And boom, here we are in that circumstance. So any of these systemic changes or strategic changes that we put in place, policies we put in place, are not going to make much of an impact until we deal with those kinds of issues at a much deeper level. And frankly, even the police department, because I've seen them and I've trained a lot of them, even the police departments who are doing that kind of work are not doing it systemically. They're running people through a training program, sending them back out.
And say, I train them.
That's right.
Exactly.
But what
I wanna go to
percentage
her
of
point.
black cops, what percentage of cops in DC are black? And what, okay, so DC is unique because we have so many law enforcement agencies, you know, that are able to stop like people if you're close to the White House, whatever. But is DC's police department not predominantly African American?
I don't speak for them, so I couldn't really tell you that honestly.
Oh, I thought you were.
No, I'm not with MPD. I'm with MPD.
The executive.
We have
There's a
law
difference
enforcement across the board.
Oh.
We represent multiple law
I'm with
enforcement.
Charlie.
Yeah. But I want to ask a question to Howard here, and because you mentioned that age breakdown where the children become vulnerable.
Right.
And I think that is due in part to a lot of factors, some of which mean that they aren't perhaps being able to be parented because maybe the parents have other obligations or their challenges are so insurmountable that they don't have perhaps the same amount of time or maybe even the opportunity. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that it is not happening. And the reason I bring this up is because in working with MPD and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and you all may be familiar with the story that, and maybe you all covered it, the missing black girls of DC back at the end of 2015 and beginning of 2016. And the reason that got such fanfare was because Nick Mick, it was Assistant Chief Chanel Dickerson, Chief Newsham, and Mayor Bowser. They looked at these statistics, and it was actually, I think, the lead of Assistant Chief Dickerson, who said, we've got girls here who are being classified as runaways and as truants, and that's part of the problem for their being missing. They were the part of the problem. Then you had little white girls over here who were victims. They were trafficking, potential human trafficking victims and things like that, so they popped up on Amber Alerts and things like that.
Right.
And so basically looked at it and said, well, the circumstances are the same. So, virtually over a matter of weeks, they moved these girls from this category to this category, and it looked like an explosion and this abduction of black girls, when it really wasn't the case. But I say that to say that it's how society views people differently. Right. And so in your situation, when you're talking about the kids who are now becoming vulnerable, the kids of color, they become vulnerable, but is it because society treats them differently, or is it because of circumstances that prevent them from getting the same type of attention that their colleagues or their counterparts are receiving?
The answer is probably both. Both things are happening. Both things are influencing the circumstance. And the thing that's really dangerous right now, Tony, in terms of that, is that kids are getting suspended from school at earlier and earlier ages, and the disproportionality of black kids who are getting suspended from school above any other race is dramatic. And so you've got kids who are getting suspended now from kindergarten and first grade. That never happened before. Never happened before. And the reason is because schools are so afraid of an incident occurring that could tarnish the whole school, and schools are on hyper alert. So it's all fear that's driving this stuff. But nonetheless, you now got a kid who at the age of 5 or 6 or 7 years old is already being declared not welcomed in this school. And then they come back and they have to deal with the shame and embarrassment having that happen, so they start to check out, and so that whole process that used to be starting at 10 through 13 is now starting at 8 and 7 and 6 and 5. And so we can see that, by the time you get to that age, the gap is so great. By the time you get to the time that we actually start to, quote, pay attention, when they're 15 or 16 or something and they're getting into serious gang activity, we've lost them for so many years. At this point, there's just no way to get them back. And so it really requires systemic. I mean, it's not unlike if you think what's happening right now with the Me Too movement. You know, where we get Harvey Weinstein, and then we get this one, and we get that one, and it's all about who's the next bad guy we get, but not enough conversation about what's the system in place that everybody know what Harvey Weinstein was doing for 20 years, and wink in their eyes and say, that's just Harvey, and do nothing about it. That's the problem. I'm not saying that Harvey shouldn't be held accountable. Of course he should. But until we deal with the system that produces one Harvey Weinstein after another, or in this case, one Michael Brown's death after another, or somebody else's death after another, until we look at those systemic issues, we're going to be dealing with this till the cows come home.
Is there any prospect of dealing with retraining police more appropriately on a broad scale rather than community by community or police force by police?
It has to be done on a broad scale. Because what you're talking about,
But
it has to be.
Did the Justice Department get gutted in such a way that that's not gonna happen?
No, they don't get gutted.
Well, no,
Well,
Trump versus Obama is what I'm talking about.
I'm not sure if this Justice Department's priority is retraining officers, but there are things you can do. You know, so for example, the Justice Department gives out grants to police departments. They look at statistics from the police departments. So what statistics are you looking at? Are you looking at the number of arrests? Or are you looking at other measures of how the community feels about their officers? So how are we evaluating our police departments at the national level and giving them funding as a result of it? Another thing the federal government can do is use its ability to compile data to shed light on instances of departments that need more training and more work. So for example, there's a report that comes out about deaths in police custody. And every police department has to send to the federal government their number of deaths in police custody they had over a given year. The departments don't comply. They don't comply with that rule and no one enforces it.
Right.
So, you know, we need to, in terms of using the federal government as a tool, it's important to put teeth in these measures that are designed to hold departments accountable and also incentivize departments to train when they're not doing so.
But is that gonna happen in this era or not? That's
Well,
what I'm getting at.
so I can tell you that we were hired by the Department of Homeland Security the last year of the Obama administration to design unconscious bias training for the FBI, just a whole range of the alphabet, right? And on day one of the new administration, a plug was pulled on that project. Day one. And a lot of it gets back to the dynamic, I mean, you know, some of it's pure racism, overt, but some of it also gets back to the dynamic that Ron was talking about, which is the experience, whether or not people have the experience of these issues being real to them because they live through these kinds of dynamics, as opposed to it just happening somewhere else to somebody else. And so what ends up happening is if I don't see it and I don't know that it's real, my tendency is to support the police officers. Now, mind you, this is a long-time cultural training. When I was a boy, and I guess Michael is true for you, because most of us who were white, when we were kids, we were told if you're ever in trouble, find a police officer. Folks I know who are African American were told if you're ever in trouble, it's probably because of a police officer.
Well, don't call the police.
That's right. So Michael Brown gets shot in Ferguson, and the tendency for a lot of white people is to say, why would a police officer just do that for no reason? Because that's our orientation. We've been trained since we were this tall to believe that. Whereas an African American who's had the experience of dealing with police officers in the community all the time says, here we go again. And so, you know, these are so deeply ingrained in our cultural patterns, and I think we're fooling ourselves to think there's any easy solution. Yeah. What we've got to do is take all of these different things we're talking about and move each of them along all the time. There's no magic bullet to this.
Right, and so I would, to answer your question though, from a systemic standpoint, federal government-wide, I wouldn't hold my breath thinking that something's going to happen magically. Because any organization is only as good as its leadership, right? So you could have a good leader, have a bad leader, but you know, you're only going to get that, to Ron's point of view, whatever that instruction is, that's what's going to be basically enacted. What we are trying to do in Nolan, we have an awful lot of black police officers who are in executive positions across the country. I
mean, these guys deal with police chiefs. I mean, if you know, they deal with black police chiefs.
And many of us are. In North Carolina, we've got 4 black female police chiefs in North Carolina. Wow. We've got 2
highway patrolmen,
in Dallas, police chiefs,
state police,
metropolitan police. I'm sorry, we've got police presence globally and certainly domestically. What we try to do is we try to educate and promote our executives. This is one of the reasons that, this is one of the reasons that Noble was founded, so that we can have that equilibrium in terms of policing. But, so while we are trying to do it on a large scale, yes, we will continuously meet, and we meet with the heads of all the departments here. As I said, I have a good relationship with MPD, Chief Newsham. I was an executive at Department of Labor, IG. We have the FBI executives. We have an awful lot of people who are in these positions, not just here in the district, but across the country. And we have noble chapters across the country. We have some 60 chapters. And so while we understand this is a very difficult issue, we remain undaunted in pushing it. So when we have someone in one of those particular police departments come across an issue or become aware of an issue, they are making changes right there.
Not all of them.
Well, our representatives, our noble representatives of those who that I have seen having issues. For example, Calvin.
Philadelphia.
Well, he's
Philadelphia.
let's say the active.
No, Philadelphia. The police chief in Philadelphia.
He's a little bit more.
That's what I'm just saying.
Okay, so I say it correct. But Tamir Rice, for example, right? In Cleveland, right? When Tamir Rice was shot in Cleveland, Ron made a point earlier. We were talking about the vetting system for police officers. Well, Calvin, he's the chief there, and he actually spoke to us. He said the problem with that was that police officer, he had come from another police department, and they were vetting him, but they hadn't vetted him deeply enough yet. It was not completed yet, at least not according to what they're doing now. And so he went back and he changed the process, so that will never happen again. So if they went 3 layers, now they're going 8 layers. You know, and that's at the direction of a black police chief, a noble member who saw a problem. Maybe it was a blind spot because it was one of those things. He said, well, you know, it wasn't a problem before, but now that I see it is a problem, we need to fix this.
We didn't know that the Fraternal Order of Police in Cleveland is trying to reinstate that office.
Let me just say this about black police chiefs in Baltimore, and I'm quite likely, don't get me wrong, but that's not the answer. Baltimore, by the time Freddie Gray was killed, had 4 black police chiefs. They are now up to about 6 or 7. Okay? When he was killed, they had 4 black police chiefs. Now, you say, well, that's just one situation. But what did the report, when they did the consent decree, the report said, not only had they had all these police chiefs, they had all these black mayors. It said that the police department in Baltimore, Maryland, ran roughshod not over the citizens, but the black citizens. With the black police chiefs, 4 of them, they were running roughshod over the black citizens of Baltimore. And one man had been arrested 20 times, had never been charged with anything.
Right, and I'm not,
I'm not types as white police officers.
Well, that's exactly right. You know, there's no perfect solution. The police are policemen. Police officers are people. You will have bad apples and bad actors, irrespective of the color of their skin. But I would rather have. Well, let me not say that.
Okay.
What I'd like to have, I would rather have a conscientious police officer, police chief, regardless of color,
Yes.
in the community. And what we believe, or what we have seen, oftentimes, and there are problems too, where we have police chiefs who are of color who do not do the job particularly well. But we also see that there's a certain sensitivity and a certain understanding that police chiefs of color have as it relates to communities of color, because they come from that. So they can relate a little bit better, perhaps they have a little more sensitivity. And in an era where the training that we have is faulty by design, and people are being taught that same training time and time again, I will defer to my sensitivity as a black person or a person of color to dealing with a community of color, more so than I will with someone who said, well, this is what the book says. The book says I should do X, Y, and Z. And maybe I have something that is, I have a nuance because I come from that community. And I won't get it right all the time, but perhaps I have a nuance that tells me that maybe there's maybe I should ask an additional question. I should go a little bit further. I should give this person the benefit of the doubt, because they undoubtedly haven't gotten it before, and they're not going to get it from my counterpart who says all I got to do is check off this box. So I get that black police chiefs are not perfect. I'm not suggesting that, but I do think that people of color in positions of authority have a certain understanding. Not that people who are not of color don't have a certain sensitivity or a certain desire, but they have a certain inherent understanding of what it means just to be a person of color in this country.
Well, I think there's another piece to that, Tony, which gets back to the point that Allison was making before relative to trust, and that is when you have officers of color, in particular a chief of color, the community might give them a little bit more trust in
It's a
that.
relationship.
And so the relationship is enhanced on both sides potentially. It's not just the sensitivity of the police chief or the police officers, but it's also the fact that people in the community are more likely to give them the benefit of the doubt, therefore to come in a little less fearful, a little less hostile, and so the whole system kind of cools off a little bit. potentially.
But if you're a white chief, they'll give you the same, if you
Yeah.
demonstrated yourself.
Right, well, you can prove yourself, and I'm not suggesting there aren't bad apples in any group, but as a
The argument against that is Baltimore.
group.
The argument against that is Baltimore.
There are exceptions, there are exceptions,
But that was four black police.
No, of course.
That was four black.
But there's also a whole system in place in that city.
There were four black police chiefs who could have said, you know what, we're gonna change. It's not even about color. It's about who are you the police
Well,
chief?
it's always
No. The police chief told me this. Who are you the police chief for?
Well, it's
If you
something else.
no, let me finish.
Okay, go ahead.
If you're the police chief for the police, or are you the police chief for the people of the city? If you're just as people, right? Well, I'm just saying for the whole city. In other words, if you're the police chief which is what your friend did in Philadelphia. He was the police, so he defended those officers when they arrested those two guys who were sitting around in Starbucks waiting for somebody to show up. He defended those officers instead of taking a different approach, because he was the police chief for who?
Well,
The
no, wait,
police.
no, let's not cite.
No, but he was the police chief.
Well, wait a minute, hold on.
And he even had to come back and apologize.
Sure, but here's the
because
thing.
he was wrong.
But here's the thing.
He was
You're
wrong.
right. You've got to lead. In order to lead, you got to have people who will follow you. Whether that be the community,
So then you gotta get
or
the
whether
right
that be community, or whether it be
Get
your
the right
police
people,
force.
and that's what
I grant
that's
you,
what
you gotta get it
that's
right.
what the police chief explained to me.
Right.
The one that tell you this that did Richmond then. He said, Ron, you're gonna have to find people.
Yes.
Some people you're gonna fire, but you gotta find people who will go along with your vision. You do not protect the old vision, which is what the guy in Philadelphia did. Because at the end of the day, if you are the police chief just for the police,
But there's training that needs to be done
but
everywhere.
no, but if you're the police just for the police, who's my police chief? Who's the guy that's gonna stand in that room for me?
That sounds
Who's gonna
good,
stand
Ron.
up for my
That sounds good, and it should happen that way. In a perfect world, you're right. But the problem is that police chief, his training may have been, and it evidently was also insufficient. You know, it was unsatisfactory because the police chief, yes, because he should have known what to do in that situation. Now he's human; he could have made a mistake. But the fact of the matter is, just because he's police chief doesn't mean that he doesn't put his foot in his mouth and say something stupid.
Well, here's a simple conversation. You know what? That is not an outcome that anybody would want to have happen. Not the police and not the citizens. We're gonna dive deep into that situation to make sure that does not happen. Now that's the police chief for everybody.
Well, you find that police chief and put him in there.
That's my point.
Right?
That's my point. That this problem.
Yeah, but he gonna lose his job.
The thing is,
But he should. But you would want him to be.
but the thing is, that police chief needed to lose his job. But you're not gonna get change until you get police chiefs who are representing you.
But there's something else which is it's no coincidence.
We have an example of a place where the black police chief made a difference.
Richard Pennington went down to New Orleans. That was one of the worst police departments on the planet.
Yes.
And he was the deputy police chief here. And he cleaned that thing out.
Right.
But see, this is a really important point. I know Dick's saying we got to wrap up, but this is a really important point that when you look at at least the ones I've seen, and I'd be interested to see whether this was true in your research, but at least the circumstances I've seen, when police chiefs come in and clean up the department, they're almost always from outside. They're almost always from outside. And this is really important because what happens is when people grow up within the system, they get promoted because they're good in that system. And so they're going to have tendency to be first of all to find the way we behave in that system normal to me, and secondly to be rewarded for how well I am behaving in that very system. That's what got me there. So I'm not going to come in and throw out everything that got me rewarded.
Because you won't have
to do what I did to get there.
Because you won't have a police department.
That's
and
exactly
again,
right.
you have bad police departments that need retrenching. I get that. but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But so you have to find a way to, because tonight if we fire the police, you go home, you don't have any security, you don't have anyone to protect you. So you've got to, well, no, I'm talking about police force.
We're not talking about the force.
You're talking about both.
No, what I'm saying, it's just like everybody in here is working bad newsrooms, they work in good newsrooms.
Right.
What made the difference between the bad good newsroom and the good newsroom? The editor.
And yet-
Okay, and that's what I'm saying. Because you got a new editor, they looked around and said, this editor sucks. The company said, you know what, if we want this newspaper to do well, or this publication, we're gonna have to get a new editor.
You know,
And we didn't get rid of all the reporters, we got rid of the editors.
Right.
And then we got rid of some reporters.
But you come up in the system. Okay.
I think that there's a lot of talk about the one person, the one police chief, but it's not about one person. Because,
absolutely not.
in the district, we had a lot of reforms. They reformed the structure of the police department in response to a consent decree in the late 90s. And they adopted all sorts of new institutional mechanisms. And they did a review of those mechanisms 15 years later. And what they found was that, the level of police homicides were down, but the institutional mechanisms were starting to crumble.
Right.
And so it's not about one person that you're accountable to, it's about the community you're accountable to. And so I think this goes back to what Ron was saying at the start of this conversation. How can we make sure the people who deal with the burdens of the police are the ones deciding how they're policed? How can we make sure the people who want to have safe neighborhoods, but also want to be safe from excessive force by officers, are able to find that balance? And so ultimately I think resolving policing is there's a lot of things we want to do in terms of individual departments, but it's a political solution. It's about empowering the people who are most affected to make the choices about how they're affected.
Okay, that will have to be the last word.
I think that's
I do want to say one thing, and that is, nobody's talked about the average policeman on the street, and I don't know whether this is just anecdotal or what, but I have noticed that there are a lot of police officers that I've had encounters with who have gone out of their way to be friendly and all that because they know what I see on television and what I'm reading about police, and they want to be sure that I know that they're not all like that. So I don't know how widespread